let's take a few minutes to talk about the different types of saws. If you've done any research at all on the different types of woodworking handsaws, you've likely come across at least a dozen different names for them. Names like handsaw, panel saw, tenon saw, sash saw, carcass saw, dovetail saw, coping saw, turning saw, bow saw, frame saw, and the list goes on from there. In theory, these names provide us with a clue about the intended use of the saw. For example, a tenon saw is for sawing tenons, and a dovetail saw is for sawing dovetails. But that's not always the case. A bow saw, for example, gets its name because it kind of looks like, well, an archery bow. But bow saws can be set up to do a lot of different tasks. So we can't always assume that a saw's name is going to tell us what the saw is set up to do. In practice, there are really only two different types of saws. But we'll come back to that thought in a minute. At a high level, there are only two types of cuts that you can make. Wood is no different than a bundle of straws. We can cut in the direction of the straws, which we call a rip cut, or we can cut across the straws, which we call a cross cut. Of course, you can also cut diagonally across the board, or you can cut curves, and these would be kind of hybrid cuts, part cross cut and part rip. But let's not worry about that for now. For the time being, let's just focus on a pure rip cut or a pure cross cut. Now, since there are only two different types of cuts, a rip cut and a cross cut, then it would follow that there are also only two different types of saws, a rip saw and a cross cut saw. However, you can't tell if a saw is a rip saw or a cross cut saw simply by looking at the style or size of the saw. These two saws look to be identical, so one might assume that they are in fact the same saw. However, this is a rip saw and this is a cross cut saw. Similarly, these two saws look to be identical. So again, one might assume that they are in fact the same saw. But once again, this is a rip saw and this is a crosscut saw. In fact, any size or style of saw can be a rip saw or a crosscut saw. The only way to tell if a saw is a rip saw or a crosscut saw is to look closely at the teeth, because the only difference between a rip saw and a crosscut saw is how the teeth are sharpened. Let's try and simulate a kind of macro level representation of the way that rip saws and crosscut saws differ in their tooth geometry and the way that they operate. We'll use this chisel to represent the tooth of a rip saw and this marking knife to represent the tooth of a crosscut saw. To make a cut in either direction, we have to consider how the fibers of the wood are oriented and how they would then best be severed. If I want to rip this board, I could try to use a knife, but as you'll notice, the knife tends to catch in the grain and it wants to follow the grain lines rather than the straight line that we're trying to follow. In addition, the sharp edge of the knife tends to get in between the fibers and can split the wood rather than saw in a nice straight line. So maybe this isn't the best tool for the job. If I use a chisel, however, you can see that we can make these nice tight, these little shavings. The chisel does not follow the grain. In fact, its sharp edge is oriented perpendicular to the direction of the grain, so it tends to sever the fibers across, and it makes much more efficient work of cutting the wood in this direction. So based on this little experiment, we can conclude that it's best to shape a saw's teeth like chisels when it comes to ripping along the grain. But what about cross-cutting? In this case, if I try to use a tooth shaped like a chisel, you can see how it just splinters and tears the grain terribly. So this is not going to be an efficient way to cut this board. However, if I use a knife to sever across the fibers, I can cut quite cleanly and not tear all those fibers out. And in fact, if I take this knife and turn the bevels to the other side, I can actually cut a trench across the wood, which gives us the start of our crosscut. So based upon this experiment, it's pretty obvious that the best geometry for saw teeth that are intended for cross-cutting is to shape them like knives. As we just demonstrated, the only difference between rip saws and crosscut saws is the shape of their teeth. So as we discussed earlier, the only way to really know if a saw is a rip saw or a crosscut saw is to take a close look at the teeth to see how they're sharpened. When we look closely at the teeth on the rip saw, it's pretty clear how they resemble a row of identical chisels. In use, the teeth of the rip saw will therefore not produce dust, but instead each tooth will cut small shavings from the wood, leaving a kerf or groove for the saw to follow. Looking at the crosscut teeth, you can see that the edges of the teeth are beveled just like the marking knife that we used earlier. In fact, each tooth has its bevels on the opposite side from the teeth immediately adjacent to it. So what we have are two rows of knives that are facing each other. Having two opposing rows of knives serves to create two parallel knife cuts, giving you precise, clean crosscuts. So the takeaway here is that no matter the name, size, or style of the saw, there really are only two types of saws: rip saws and crosscut saws. So if you're making a rip cut, choose a saw with rip teeth. If you're making a crosscut, choose a saw with crosscut teeth. If you do that, you'll be well on your way to making precise, efficient cuts with your handsaws. One last point. I brought up diagonal cuts earlier, and I mentioned that they're a little bit rip and a little bit crosscut. Don't fret over these cuts too much. If the angle is closer to a rip cut, use a rip saw. If the angle is closer to a crosscut, use a crosscut saw. In most cases, following this rule of thumb will result in the cleanest, most efficient cuts.